When I talk about Raymond Briggs with people who aren't familiar with him or his work, I say things like, imagine if Dr. Seuss was also Will Eisner. That's the fastest way I can think of to encapsulate the unique charm and the works of this terrific writer-artist. That's because for over the last 40 years, Raymond Briggs has illustrated and written and illustrated both some classics of children's literature. In his native Great Britain, he is an institution, having created works like The Snowman and Father Christmas, which have become holiday traditions, not just in their original comics or illustrated book forms, but also as animated specials and musicals that have become a yearly tradition. He has worked in both children's books, illustration, and comics, which sometimes have a gray area of intersection, combining as they both do image and text. But at the same time as his lauded, beloved children's work, he is also a pioneer of longer form comic storytelling for grown-ups. What makes him so special is not just his expertise in appealing to both children and to adults, but also the fact that what separates these two is really just tone and content, not his art style, which is very similar no matter if he's working for children or for grown-ups. What this means is that the extremely evocative and pleasurable images and art styles that are so appealing in children's work are very uniquely harnessed by him to tell some very powerful stories that are full of gentle satire as well as emotional pathos in a way that is truly unique and unusual, because when you read his grown-up stuff, you're looking at illustrations and artwork that would be absolutely at home, and obviously so in a children's book. The kind of observations he has, both about human foibles and foolishnesses, as well as about human love and tenderness, all of these observations take on that particularly potent power. In today's episode, I'm not going to look at all the books Raymond Briggs has. There are more than 24 of them. I'm instead going to focus on 4 comics or graphic novels, because he is, as I said, a pioneer of the long-form single story in a bound volume. I'm going to look at 4 such books, one of them ostensibly for children, but extremely appealing and very popular with all ages, and 3 of them for more grown-up reading. The first of these books is Father Christmas, a beloved classic that was published in 1973, a couple of years before Will Eisner's A Contract with God. And we're going to be looking not at this full-sized version, but this miniaturized version of it, something that Raymond Briggs himself really appreciated and that affected how he worked on some other comics in the future. The second book is the tragicomic Gentleman Jim, in which he takes his classic children's books illustration style but applies it to a comic that is as absurd as it is sad. The third book is When the Wind Blows, a sequel of sorts to Gentleman Jim and a classic story that is probably, if you are familiar with Raymond Briggs outside of Great Britain, if he is known, it's probably for this book and the animated movie that was based on it. This is a horrifying and devastating anti-nuclear and anti-war parable. And finally, we have probably his magnum opus, the non-fictional Ethel and Ernest, based on the story of his parents. This is subtitled A True Story, and it's his evocation of a life spent together that is as ambitious as it is triumphant, and sort of contextualizes all of his work, all of his books. After you read this, you can find a thread that runs through them, and that thread is his parents. So let's dive right into a closer look at 4 terrific comics by Raymond Briggs. Father Christmas may be one of the most perfect children's comics I've ever read. It is charming and beautifully drawn. It's full of lovely colors, and it features Father Christmas, a beloved children's character. But there is a lot more going on in this story than you might originally think. This Father Christmas, although he looks like the Saint Nick Santa Claus that we're all used to, is a slightly different take on that classic character. He is curmudgeonly and seems to be very unhappy with the weather and the snow. He's not at all happy that it's Christmas because now he has a lot of work to do. He doesn't express himself with a lot of words, but pretty much all the words you get from him are curses in a very children-friendly way. His first words are blooming Christmas is here again. Then he says, I hate winter, blooming snow, blow the blooming snow. And throughout this book, he curses at almost everything he encounters, the effort that he has to put in, the kind of conditions that he has to deal with. At the same time, he is also shown to have moments of pleasure and joy, particularly when dealing with his animals, his cat and his dog, his reindeer, whom he takes care of, and he also enjoys a drink. There's no toy factory or elves in this story. There isn't a Mrs. Santa Claus or any of the other things that we're used to seeing surround Santa Claus. Instead, we see him as a single person. I think there is a hint somewhere that he might be a widower, itself a slightly dark edge to what should be a light children's story. But why he's delivering these presents and doing this job that he doesn't seem to enjoy very much is never quite addressed directly. He simply goes out on Christmas Eve with a sleigh full of presents and attaches that sleigh to his magic reindeer and takes off flying. The combination of the magical fantasy part of Father Christmas to this rather working class, curmudgeonly old man is perhaps the most unique and charming take on this beloved character that I've ever read. There is no doubt that this is comics. There are panel layouts and design. There is repetition of motifs. There is sequential movement and juxtaposition, all hallmarks of comics vocabulary. And there are things like speech balloons, of course. This comic is also crammed full of detail. Every corner of every panel seems to be bursting with charming, idiosyncratic things, starting from his own house, including the bedroom, the kitchen, the front yard, and then going over the world through the variety of different houses that he visits, the little breaks that he takes, the notes that he encounters, the snacks that are left out for him, the weather conditions that he is subjected to. It's the level of detail and their charming depiction that gives this book its power. And this detail is not limited only to the physical aspects, which are gorgeous, whether it's the cross-section of a house or a series of vignettes interspersed with the clock showing the passage of time through the night. This level of detail is mirrored in the detail of character. Even though Father Christmas only speaks mainly to curse and every now and then to appreciate things, the distinct picture that is created for us of this man doing this thing that he both seems to love and not love so much, right up to the final surly panel in which he wishes the readers a happy blooming Christmas to you too. The book conjures up a very specific image of a not quite disgruntled, not quite joyous working class man. The only human being Father Christmas encounters in this story is a milkman starting his rounds just as Father Christmas is winding up, who is a representation of Raymond Briggs' father, and that equates the two of them. These are two people who work at times when everyone else is sleeping in order to serve them, and this depiction of Father Christmas, this depiction of a serviceman, is what I think sets this apart from any other portrayal of this character. In the introduction to this miniature version, Raymond Briggs does say that it makes him appreciate the level of detail in this story as well, and that's something very interesting. I've always thought that the larger you blow up a comic, the better. This idea of how details can be highlighted in a particular art style by actually actually shrinking things down was a new thing to me. For kids and grown-ups alike, Father Christmas is not just an utterly charming book, but also a superb example of comics, and it contains within it themes that we will see resonate across the other books by Raymond Briggs as well. Themes of working class struggle and joy, confusion, befuddlement, disgruntlement, right alongside acceptance, and of course lovely drawings with beautiful colors. Gentleman Jim tells the story of Jim Blogg, a public toilet cleaner who lives with his wife and daydreams about having a different job. His daily life is given to us in small little square panels and his daydreams in large ones that burst out of their boundaries and borders. And this story has a tone and feel that's slightly similar to the classic James Thurber short story, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, but takes it a little further than just the comedy of the daydreams. Jim Blogg is given to us as a person who doesn't quite understand the new world that he lives in. He looks at the newspaper and looks at all the different jobs that are available, but also is confused by the requirements of them. He never got his O-levels or A-levels, and he figures that's what they're doing in school these days. When he was in school, he remarks all he got was a Bible. And his wife is shown as an accepting woman who doesn't quite understand her husband's fantasies or wanting more from his life, but supports and accepts them. In order to make one particular fantasy of his come true, to be a highwayman, Jim takes a couple of steps that just put him in complete opposition with the world that he lives in. And it's partly comedic and partly tragic the way that this man, because of either a lack of education, a lack of awareness, but a total dedication to dreams, is put at odds with the police and the government and the zoning laws and the variety of things that he comes up against. This story could very easily have made fun of a character who just doesn't understand, who just is clueless, but there is a gentle satire of society. There is nothing that society puts on him that we don't understand or that we don't recognize. We completely understand you can't just have a horse that is making a mess on public roads without a permit and you've got to be responsible for your actions. We understand that, but we also can see the beauty and the innocent joy of Jim's dreams. So the fact that these things are incompatible doesn't only result in us thinking that Jim doesn't belong. Somewhere a question does come up of what kind of a world have we created in which these things have no place. But like with most themes and motifs in Raymond Briggs stories, you're not hit over the head with any of this at all. You're given this gentle comedy, you're given this thing, but as the creeping sadness, as the arc of the tragedy makes its way into the story and leads to a particular conclusion that is, again, neither tragic nor comedic, but a unique mixture of the two. As you take this journey, you have so many different conflicting emotions. You're not sure what you should be laughing at. You're not sure what you should be feeling sad about. That's the gentle complexity that Raymond Briggs has made his signature. Like Father Christmas before it, Gentleman Jim is a book that is full of detail, the detail of the exterior as well as the interior perfectly balanced. And you have over here an expansion of the focus on the working class life. The lack of education or the so-called ignorance does not mean that you cannot be happy, but there is also the added dimension of the tragedy, the incompatibility of a certain group of people or a certain kind of individual with the world that we live in. All of which is magnified and crystallized in the sequel, When the Wind Blows. When the Wind Blows sees Jim and his wife Hilda living in the countryside in what I'm assuming is a retired period of their lives, and is made up of small panels densely packed together, an inspiration that Raymond Briggs apparently took from a miniaturized edition of Father Christmas. Like we saw in Gentleman Jim, their everyday life is given to us with these tiny panels, giving us a sense of constriction and density, which is then interspersed every now and then with these huge open two-page spreads of nuclear armament and something happening somewhere else in the world. When the Wind Blows tells the story of this elderly working class couple first dealing with the news of rising nuclear tensions, an impending war, and then with an actual nuclear attack, and then the fallout from the nuclear attack. The density of this story is not just about the panels and the level of dialogue and exchange, much of which is very funny, is very humorous, because they seem so clueless. They seem to be so oblivious. Jim is a very curious man. His lack of education or his lack of information isn't something he lets interfere. He is very curious. He wants to find out stuff. And for most of this story, he's dealing with half information and with misunderstood or misconceived concepts. His wife seems to be very oblivious. She's not at all interested, but just like she was in Gentleman Jim, she is completely in support of her husband. She is willing to entertain his little peccadillos and allow him to build a nuclear fallout shelter in the middle of their living room from doors that he has removed from the house, and all of these other things. She has some complaints every now and then, how she refuses to allow certain things and she refuses to behave in certain ways because it's just not proper. But again, like Gentleman Jim, alongside their own cluelessness and their own confusion or befuddlement at the world, there is the hint of commentary about the world itself. There's obviously the nuclear armament and what's coming. That is something that looms as a dangerous presence. There is also the Second World War, which is something that Jim and Hilda, his wife, have lived through already, and somehow in recollecting it, it's almost as if it was an adventure. They romanticize the war, and they romanticize the time of the war and the leaders they had and the constrained life that they had. One of the central pieces of comedy and tragedy in this story is how they think of nuclear war and a nuclear holocaust in the same ways that they approached the previous wars. Of course, we as readers, we as knowledgeable, informed people, we know that there's a very big difference between the two, but Jim and Hilda do not. And we can see the end of this story coming because of these misconceptions. But this is very directly contributed to not just by their misunderstanding or non-knowing of things, but by government pamphlets and information that is just not correct. The diminishment of the seriousness of nuclear war, the kind of things that people are instructed to do, seem to us to be ridiculous and therefore horrifying to think that these are things people considered would protect them from nuclear fallout. Combining the lack of sophistication of our central characters with the rather oblivious treatment of such people by governments and countries that go to war, what we're left with in this book is elements of both tragedy and comedy directly coming from the same things. When the Wind Blows is a lauded masterpiece of anti-war storytelling, and the reason why it has the unique power that it does is because it gives us unsophisticated, not very smart, not very knowledgeable people, but insists that they too are people who belong in our population. They too are members of communities, and it doesn't matter that they don't know certain things. It doesn't matter that they don't understand certain concepts. The responsibilities of the governments include responsibilities to these people. So the fact that they bear or they go through the things they go through cannot be put completely on them, because it wouldn't have mattered if they had read and understood everything perfectly. The nightmare of nuclear war and Holocaust and the way that it affects everyday people, truly everyday people, is what this story is all about. The Jim and Hilda stories, Gentleman Jim and When the Wind Blows, were published in the early 1980s. And in the 1990s, Raymond Briggs published Ethel and Ernest, a true story, a story about his parents. With this book, it's as if a new dimension was added to Jim and Hilda, because you could see in Ethel and Ernest the same conversations, the same patterns of behavior, interaction, as well as outlook that was previously seen in the fictional characters of Jim and Hilda. In Ethel and Ernest, Raymond Briggs tells the story of his parents meeting all the way back in 1928, and then tells of their time together until their deaths, both in 1971. Through these years, we are given a series of quick vignettes. This isn't really a long-form story that continues with a scene for very long. Rather, it's a mosaic, a collage of events and sequences of things that they go through and their reactions to them. Some of them very domestic, like getting new jobs, buying a house in which they would live in for the rest of their lives for over 40 years. The acquisition of furniture and gadgets as technology changes around them, as well as their behavior and interaction with larger global political and economic things like the Great Depression or the Second World War. Through these series of vignettes, a very delicate portrait is created, again, like we have seen before, of two working class people who may not have the greatest education, the greatest levels of sophistication, but are happy in their lives together, have dreams and aspirations, but also have confusion and befuddlement of the world around them. The gentleness of this storytelling builds powerfully through these pages. Ethel and Ernest is undoubtedly Raymond Briggs's magnum opus because of the magnificence of its scope, because of the ambition of what it wants to do. It's not just telling you the stories of his parents, but it's telling you the story of an entire society, of an entire class, where honestly, when I was reading it, I didn't think of them as working class. I thought of them as middle class. They seem to be able to afford things. They're obviously not very rich. There are comments enough throughout the story that tell you exactly that they're below the poverty line, at least as far as is defined by the newspapers and economics. But they're able to not only buy a house, but put things into it. He works as a milkman. She's a housewife until the Second World War, when she starts working in an office, which is a dream come true for her. And the way that they talk about the world around them seems quaint at first, but then again achieves a certain level of sadness where I wonder why more people can't live like this. What is it, like we saw in the earlier Jim and Hilda stories, what is it about the world that makes these people so a thing of the past? The beauty of their lives together may be simple, but is never simplistic. There are political arguments they have. Ernest has strong socialist tendencies. Ethel is very much a conservative, and their banter and barbs about politics are among some of the gentlest funny political debate I've ever seen. Like with Gentleman Jim and When the Wind Blows, there is a balance between confusion and befuddlement and confidence. And that is, I think, where the real charm of Raymond Briggs's comics comes in. He is able to create empathetic characters, and by that he's able to get our empathy to understand that the world isn't just what we know and what we encounter, that it is rich and full of love and beauty at all levels of economics, at all levels of education, at all levels of knowledge and information. And it is that celebration of that pure and simple love that allows him to then comment on governments, on society, on war, on ways of economically manipulating things that deprive people of some of the most basic necessities, that he shows us that people don't need a lot to be happy, but what they do need is each other. And that's where Ethel and Ernest gets its final magnificent power from. It shows you this couple through their life together, through thick and thin, but without any of the usual drama that we get in long marriages. It's a simple and full existence, and the passing of one of them leaves the other one empty and incomplete in a way that is absolutely true and absolutely heartbreaking. As I said at the top of the video, when you read Ethel and Ernest, every other book by Raymond Briggs seems to take on a new context or seems to make sense in a new way. You understand that Ethel and Ernest have been in his stories all throughout. Even Father Christmas was mirrored to Ernest, the milkman, the only person other than Father Christmas in that story. What we get from Raymond Briggs is a glowing appreciation of the simple pleasures of life, as well as almost an elegy for a type of life that may never possibly exist again. Whether it is city governments, zoning boards, police, armies, or governments involved in war, all of these things do appear in Ethel and Ernest just the way that they do, perhaps less comedically and less sarcastically, but the undercurrent of trying to navigate this world, of trying to understand it and making more or less a pretty successful go of it, that undercurrent is what gives all of these stories their power, and that's what allows Raymond Briggs to not only be a beloved children's book illustrator and an icon of children's storytelling, but such a potent storyteller for stories for grown-ups, for addressing our world and the environments that we live in. If you haven't read any Raymond Briggs, or if you've only considered Raymond Briggs as a children's book writer and illustrator from many decades ago, I would strongly recommend you pick up Gentleman Jim, When the Wind Blows, and Ethel and Ernest. He's one of my favorite comics writer artists and someone I think everyone should read. This video came about because Paul Hatcher from the UK sent me a copy of Ethel and Ernest, which I hadn't read before. So thank you once again, Paul. And this has rekindled my love for Raymond Briggs. And now I've ordered a couple of his other books, including his children's books, because I want to read as much of him as I can. Let me know in the comments below if you'd like a closer look at those books when they come in, if you have recommendations for other Raymond Briggs books I should read, and what you thought of this quick look at 4 of his books. This has been For the Love of Comics. Thank you as always for watching, and I'll see you at the next video.